She was a girl whose heart knew no malice, a child whose every step seemed to carry gentleness into the spaces she moved through. From the time she was small, she had been the one who offered water to the weary traveler, who helped gather wood for the old women whose backs bent with age, who sang softly to calm restless children when their mothers' hands were too full. The kindness came naturally to her, like breath, and though many saw it as a gift, others watched with eyes narrowed by envy. For her quiet light reminded them of their own darkness, her selflessness exposed their selfishness, and her beauty, simple yet radiant, stirred whispers they could not silence. Her guardians had once loved her, or at least pretended to. They had taken her in when her parents were gone, raising her in their home with a bed of reeds and a place by the fire. But as the years stretched on, their warmth cooled, replaced with unease. The more the villagers praised her for her helpful hands and sweet voice, the more her guardians frowned. If a child brought food to the poor, the villagers said, it was her who had taught them generosity. If someone sang, it was her song they tried to copy. Slowly, admiration for her began to feel like an accusation against others, and so jealousy crept into every corner. Her life in the village was simple but not free from struggle. She would wake at dawn to fetch water, her bare feet cool against the morning earth, and she would smile even when the bucket strained her arms. She wove mats with the women, laughed with the children, and even when her guardians scolded her for coming home late after helping another family, she never raised her voice in anger. She was trusting to a fault, always believing that the sharp words thrown her way were not meant to wound, only spoken in haste. When her guardians made her eat last, when food was cold or scarce, she convinced herself it was fair. When they sent her to do the hardest chores, she told herself it was because they believed she was strong. Yet shadows clung to her kindness. Among the villagers, envy festered. Some whispered that she was too good, that no one could be so pure without trickery. Others muttered that the spirits must favor her, and that favor could turn dangerous if not controlled. A child as radiant as she must surely draw something beyond the human eye. Superstition grew like weeds, watering suspicion until it was nearly belief. If animals strayed too far, her name was mentioned. If someone fell sick, someone else muttered that her songs carried omens. Little by little, the admiration that once lifted her became a noose tightening around her neck. Her guardians, who should have been her shield, instead became the sharpened blade. At night, they sat whispering, their voices hushed yet sharp enough to cut through the dark. They spoke of her as if she were not family, as if she were a burden or a threat rather than the girl who had never once defied them. She draws too much attention, one would say. She makes us look like shadows beside her, another would hiss. And sometimes the word curse would slip from their tongues, tasting of fear and bitterness. The girl herself remained oblivious to the weight gathering against her. She thought the side glances were born of worry, the harsh commands from her guardians proof that they cared enough to shape her. She dreamed of a future where she might be welcomed, truly welcomed, as part of the village, where her heart would finally be seen as it was. She did not know that plans were being shaped in secret, plans that would leave her abandoned in the cruelest way. Leading up to that fateful night, signs had already begun to whisper their warnings. The laughter that once surrounded her seemed thinner. The greetings grew shorter. The warmth in her guardian's eyes cooled until it was only stone. She brushed it aside, comforting herself with the belief that tomorrow would bring better days. But tomorrow did not bring kindness. Tomorrow brought the slow gathering of resolve among those who had decided her light was too bright, her heart too untainted, her innocence too dangerous. And so, even as she sang while pounding grain, even as she hummed lullabies to restless children, even as she bent to help those who cursed her under their breath, her fate was already being sealed. She remained unaware, a dove living among those who sharpened their knives in the dark. The night of abandonment had not yet come, but its shadow was already walking behind her, silent, patient, and merciless. Under the cover of darkness, when the village was silent and the only sounds were the crickets and the far-off cry of night birds, they led her away. She had not questioned them when they told her to follow. She trusted too easily, her steps light and obedient as though she were being taken to some important ritual, some hidden celebration prepared just for her. But there was nothing joyous in their eyes, nothing kind in their hands as they guided her down the narrow path that wound away from the huts, away from the flickering warmth of firelight, into the heart of the wilderness. It was midnight, the hour when fear sharpens and shadows take on strange shapes. The girl's guardians, those who should have loved her, those whose duty it had been to protect her, walked in silence, their faces set, their hearts locked in cold resolve. Some carried torches, the flames hissing as the night air fed on them, their glow throwing wild shapes against the trees. Others carried nothing but their bitterness, their envy, their superstitions that gnawed at them more fiercely than hunger ever could. They had told themselves they were doing what was necessary. Some whispered that she was cursed, that her beauty and innocence were unnatural. Others claimed she drew the eyes of spirits, that her kindness was a dangerous gift meant to draw misfortune upon them all. And then there were those whose envy ran deepest, whose hearts could not bear the way others looked at her with admiration and affection. They despised her not because she had wronged them, but because she shone in a way they could not. So they wrapped their jealousy in the cloak of superstition and cruelty, convincing themselves that her removal would bring peace. As they walked, their whispers grew bolder. "This is the only way," one muttered. "She will not trouble us again." Another said, "The forest will claim her, and no curse will return to us." Their voices were low, yet sharp enough that she caught fragments. Her brow furrowed, her steps faltered, but still she followed, trusting that this journey had meaning beyond her understanding. When at last they reached the edge of the wilderness, where the trees closed in thick and heavy, shutting out even the faint light of the moon, they stopped. She looked around, her wide eyes searching their faces. The silence pressed against her, heavy and strange, as though the forest itself was listening. "Why have we come here?" she asked softly. But no one met her gaze. No one answered. Her confusion deepened, twisting into unease. She clutched at her shawl, feeling the night air sink into her skin like ice. She could feel the wrongness now, the coldness of their stares, the way they shifted restlessly as though waiting for her to realize the truth on her own. She tried again, her voice trembling. "Why do you look at me so? Have I done something wrong?" Still, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of torches and the hiss of wind through the leaves. Then one of them, the boldest, stepped forward. His face was shadowed, his eyes hard. "You bring danger," he said. "The spirits watch you. Misfortune follows you. We cannot keep you any longer." His words landed on her like stones, each syllable colder than the last. Her heart stuttered. "But I am your daughter, your kin," she whispered. "I have done nothing to deserve this." But the crowd would not soften. Some avoided her eyes, guilt pulling at them, while others hardened themselves with mutters of curses and omens. They believed, or wanted to believe, that abandoning her was an act of survival, not cruelty. In truth, it was both. And so, without another word, they extinguished their torches one by one, leaving only the darkness and the thick forest to embrace her. She watched the flames die, her breath quickening as the last light faded. One by one, their figures turned away, melting back into the shadows from which they had come, leaving her standing alone. Her voice broke into the night. "Do not leave me, please." She stumbled forward, her hands outstretched, but there was nothing to grasp, no hand to take hers. The sound of their retreating footsteps pounded in her ears until it was swallowed by silence. The forest loomed around her, vast and merciless. She trembled, clutching herself, trying to summon warmth where none remained. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear of the wilderness. She had believed in their love, their care, their protection. To find herself abandoned, discarded like an unwanted thing, shattered something inside her. Alone, she sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face, her sobs muffled by the heavy cloak of night. The trees stood unmoved, the ground hard beneath her, and the stars above blinked coldly, as though even they could not bear witness to such cruelty. She was lost, not only in the wilderness, but in the breaking of her trust, the betrayal of those who should have cherished her. And so began her long night in the forest, not yet knowing that this midnight betrayal would awaken forces no one in the village could ever hope to control. The night closed in like a living thing, vast and suffocating, wrapping its arms around the girl with a grip colder than stone. The wilderness was no place for a child, no place for a heart as innocent as hers, yet here she was, alone, trembling, and abandoned to the mercy of shadows. The forest stretched endlessly, the trees thick and tall, their canopies swallowing the pale light of the moon. The darkness beneath them was not still, it moved, it breathed, it whispered in voices that were not human. She stood frozen at first, her feet rooted to the ground as the last traces of the villagers' footsteps died away. Silence settled, heavy and endless, broken only by the creak of branches and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Each sound was sharp, foreign, and terrifying. She could not tell if it was the wind that made the leaves quiver, or if unseen eyes watched her from the shadows. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her breath shallow, her heart loud enough that she feared the forest itself might hear it. A sudden howl tore through the stillness, long and low, echoing from somewhere deep among the trees. It was answered by another, closer this time. "Wolves." Her blood turned to ice. She spun around, clutching her shawl tightly to her chest as though the thin fabric might shield her from teeth and claws. She had heard stories of the wolves that prowled at night, their eyes glowing like embers, their hunger unrelenting. To face them alone with no fire, no weapon, no shelter, it was certain death. She stumbled forward, her bare feet scraping against roots and stones hidden beneath the undergrowth. Every step was a struggle. The earth seemed to conspire against her, tugging at her ankles, tripping her, dragging her down. She caught herself on a tree trunk, her palms scraping against its rough bark, but even the trees felt unfriendly, their gnarled shapes twisting into monstrous silhouettes. The deeper she went, the louder the forest grew. Owls hooted from unseen branches, their cries sharp and haunting. Insects buzzed, their droning persistent in her ears, a reminder that the night was alive with countless unseen creatures. The grass rustled with snakes and lizards that slithered too close to her bare toes, making her shiver with dread. Every movement carried the weight of danger. Every sound threatened to become her last. Her stomach clenched painfully, a reminder that she had eaten nothing since the day's feast. The betrayal of her kin stung sharper now. They had filled themselves with food and laughter, only to leave her starving in the jaws of the wilderness. Hunger clawed at her insides, but fear was stronger. It drove her forward, stumbling, gasping, desperate for some sign of safety. She tried calling out once, her voice small and broken, but the sound seemed to vanish into the air, swallowed by the trees. No one would hear her. No one would come. The realization cut deeper than any blade. She was utterly alone. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision until the world around her was only shifting shadows and cruel whispers. As she walked, the ground suddenly gave way beneath her feet, and she fell, tumbling down a slope hidden in the darkness. Pain flared through her body as rocks scraped her arms and legs, and when she landed, the breath was knocked out of her. She lay there for a moment, too stunned to move, her body aching, her spirit trembling. The earth smelled damp and heavy, the air thick with the scent of moss and decay. Somewhere nearby, water trickled faintly, but the sound only made her feel smaller, weaker, swallowed by a world too vast and merciless. She forced herself up, clutching her arms around her knees to keep warm. The night seemed endless. Her guardians had always warned her of the wilderness, of spirits that wandered through the trees, of eyes that watched in silence, waiting to seize the unwary. Now, sitting in the dirt, she began to wonder if those stories had been true, or worse, if she would become one of those stories herself, a forgotten soul lost in the dark. A sudden crack of a branch made her flinch, her head snapping up in terror. Two glowing eyes stared at her from the distance, low to the ground, unblinking. A wild beast, perhaps a leopard or hyena, crouched in the dark, its breath heavy, its body tense. She pressed back against the tree behind her, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. The creature did not pounce, not yet. It only watched her, waiting. She dared not move, dared not breathe too loudly. Only after what felt like an eternity did the beast slink away, melting back into the shadows, leaving her trembling and broken. Her despair deepened, pulling at her like quicksand. She thought of the village, of the homes lit by firelight, of laughter that carried through the night. She thought of the warmth of belonging, of faces she had trusted. But all of it was gone now, replaced by cold and cruelty. She could not understand why her life had been traded for superstition and envy, why her guardians had chosen to abandon her instead of protecting her. The forest offered no answers. Only silence. Only danger. Only loneliness so sharp it cut her in half. She curled up on the ground, hugging herself tightly, rocking gently as though to remind herself that she still existed. Sleep would not come, fear would not allow it. And so she endured, wide-eyed and trembling, through the long, terrifying hours of midnight, praying desperately that she might see the light of dawn. Little did she know, the forest was not merely a place of beasts and shadows. It was alive, listening, watching her with something greater than malice, something that stirred at the sight of her suffering, something waiting for the right moment to awaken. The forest was merciless in its silence, but above the suffocating darkness, something gentle stirred, the moon. It hung high in the sky, round and pale, watching with a patient gaze as though it had been waiting for her. Its light spilled through the canopy in broken streams, painting the forest floor with silver patches. Where moments ago the girl had felt only fear and suffocation, now she noticed how the moonlight seemed to stretch itself deliberately, reaching through branches and shadows to touch her shoulders, to warm her trembling face. At first she thought it was only her imagination, a desperate mind clinging to any comfort. But as she rose to her feet, unsteady and aching, she realized the moonlight did not fall randomly. It marked a faint trail, illuminating roots she might trip over, shining on rocks that might cut her bare feet, guiding her in small, almost imperceptible ways. Each time she hesitated, uncertain which way to turn, the beam seemed brighter in one direction, urging her forward like a quiet hand pointing the way. She whispered into the night, her voice soft and broken, "Are you with me?" The words disappeared into the trees, but she could almost feel the moon answer, not in sound but in presence. Its glow grew warmer, and the silence of the forest seemed to shift, less suffocating, less cruel. For the first time since her abandonment, her tears slowed. She was not entirely alone. Step by step, she followed the patches of silver. The wilderness still growled with unseen threats. The howl of wolves in the distance, the scurry of rodents in the underbrush, the flap of wings as owls passed overhead. Yet wherever the moonlight touched, those dangers seemed to pause as though hesitant to cross its glow. When she passed beneath the illuminated branches, the shadows pulled back, as if even they respected the pale light's quiet authority. Her fear did not vanish, but it softened. Her breathing steadied. The moon's presence was not loud or forceful. It was subtle, like a mother's hand brushing tears from a child's cheek. She remembered stories whispered long ago by the village elders, tales of the moon as a guardian of the forsaken, a silent witness who guided the lost home or gave light to those swallowed by darkness. As a child, she had listened with wide eyes, never imagining she might one day rely on that very guardian. Now, standing abandoned in the heart of a merciless forest, those stories felt alive. The girl lifted her head, letting the silver glow bathe her face. The moon seemed impossibly close, like a great eye watching from above, ancient and unblinking. Its glow gave her courage to take another step, then another. She walked carefully, her feet bleeding, her body bruised, but her spirit began to stir with something new, hope. At one point, she reached a small stream, its waters black in the darkness. She had no idea how to cross, her legs trembling at the thought of falling in and being swept away. Yet just as fear overtook her, the clouds shifted and the moon's reflection shimmered on the water, revealing stones beneath the surface that she could step on. She followed the silver path, hopping from one stone to another, her arms stretched out for balance. When she reached the other side, she collapsed in relief, whispering a shaky thank you to the glowing guardian above. Hours stretched on, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her body. Still, the moon seemed to sense her struggle. Each time her knees buckled, a brighter beam lit the ground ahead, urging her not to stop. When she leaned against a tree to rest, she found that the bark glowed faintly where the light touched, smooth enough to cradle her back. Even when sleep threatened to overtake her, the moonlight kept her awake, its glow pressing her gently forward, reminding her that surrender meant death. Strange things began to happen as she walked. At the edge of her vision, the shadows seemed to shape themselves into figures, tall, faceless guardians who walked with her. She could not hear them, but she sensed them, their outlines made visible only by the moon's glow. They were not entirely human, nor entirely shadow, but their silent company gave her the courage to keep moving. Were they spirits born of the moonlight? Or were they fragments of her desperate imagination? She did not know. But when she stumbled, she felt the air around her shift, steadying her, guiding her forward. For the first time since her betrayal, the girl straightened her back. She was no longer the abandoned child, broken and trembling in the dirt. With the moon as her companion, she felt chosen, marked by something greater than the cruelty of her guardians. She began to sense that her suffering was not meaningless, that the moon's guidance carried a purpose. Perhaps the wilderness had not swallowed her whole because she was never meant to be lost. Perhaps she was walking a path that would lead to something the villagers could not understand, or escape. When dawn finally threatened the horizon, she looked back at the path she had taken. The forest behind her seemed darker, hungrier, as though it resented her survival. Yet she stood firm, her face bathed in silver light one last time before the sun began to rise. The moon was fading, but its promise lingered in her chest. It had not abandoned her, it had carried her through the longest night of her life. And though she could not yet see the graves that awaited the villagers who had betrayed her, she sensed deep within her bones that the moon was not finished. Its light was more than comfort. It was a witness. It had seen their cruelty. It had chosen her. And it would light her path all the way to justice. At first, the girl thought it was only the wind moving through the trees, whistling in soft and eerie tones. But the longer she walked beneath the fading silver of the moon, the more certain she became that what she heard were not the sounds of leaves or branches at all. The whispers had rhythm, meaning, almost like words carried on the night air. They came from everywhere and nowhere at once, weaving through the silence, rising and falling like a hidden chorus. She froze, her bare feet rooted to the damp ground, her breath caught in her throat. Then, slowly she realized they were calling her name. Her heart beat wildly, yet she was not afraid. The voices were not cruel like those of her guardians or villagers. They were sorrowful, tender, and heavy with a pain that mirrored her own. She tilted her head upward, and the moonlight seemed to brighten again, as if urging her to listen more closely. Closing her eyes, she let the whispers wash over her. One voice broke through first, low and trembling, the voice of a woman. I too was cast aside. They feared what they did not understand. But I see you. I walk with you. Another followed, a man's tone rough and broken. They silenced me, buried my name in the earth. Now you carry it forward. Her knees grew weak, but not from despair this time. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt a thread of strength binding her to something larger than herself. The spirits who spoke were not strangers. They were those wronged by the same hands that had wronged her. The villagers' ancestors, victims of the same cruelty, envy, and superstition that had condemned her. Their presence was undeniable, hovering in the stillness, carried in each gust of wind, woven into the rustle of branches. Visions began to blur the edges of her sight. At first faint, like smoke drifting in the air, they grew sharper with every breath. She saw faces, gaunt and shadowed, rising from the mist between the trees. Some were scarred, others tear-stained, all etched with sorrow and betrayal. They reached out ghostly hands not to drag her down, but to steady her trembling form. Around her, the forest shifted into a theater of memory, showing her glimpses of cruelty long forgotten by the living. Children abandoned, women accused unjustly, men punished for envy's lies. Each vision carried a weight, pressing into her chest until her own pain no longer felt solitary. She was part of a chain, a legacy of the wronged, and the whispers assured her that she was chosen to bear their strength. Her fear began to dissolve, replaced by something sharper, heavier. Resolve. The girl straightened her back, and the trembling that had defined her since the night of betrayal faded. Each whisper seemed to pour strength into her bones, weaving a shield around her heart. You are not alone, they breathed. You are the voice we never had. You are the path we could not walk. Their words did not only console, they demanded. They urged her to rise above despair, to see her survival as more than chance. The visions grew clearer still. She saw the village not as it was but as it could become. Humbled, broken, its cruelty returned to its own doorstep. She saw graves, freshly dug, bathed in the same moonlight that now guided her. She saw the faces of those who had left her in the wilderness twisted in terror, gasping for mercy that would not come. And through it all she saw herself no longer trembling, but walking with her head held high, her shadow stretching wide as though filled with the spirits who had claimed her as their own. Her breath came heavier as the weight of this revelation sank in. She was not simply abandoned. She had been set on a path carved by the hands of fate and watched over by the eyes of those who had suffered before her. The moonlight was not just light, it was witness, and the whispers were not mere sounds, they were truth. Every word reminded her that the cruelty of her people was not new, and that justice, though delayed, was inevitable. A strange calm overtook her. Her hunger still gnawed, her feet still bled, and her body still ached from the merciless wilderness, yet she no longer felt weak. Strength bloomed in her chest, rising like fire from embers. The whispers had given her something no meal or shelter could, a purpose. And with that purpose, the shadows of the forest no longer seemed hostile. They bent toward her, swayed around her, almost bowing to the quiet force she was becoming. The girl opened her eyes again and whispered into the night, I will carry you. The forest seemed to shiver in reply, leaves trembling in unseen winds. The spirit's chorus swelled, no longer faint but resonant, echoing in her chest as though her own heartbeat was in rhythm with theirs. Her once empty gaze now shone with something new, an ember of defiance, a spark of inevitability. As she pressed forward, guided by moonlight and whispers, the night no longer felt suffocating. It felt alive, waiting. The girl understood now that she was more than abandoned prey, she was chosen vessel. Every step she took was not her own but carried the weight of countless souls who had been silenced before her. Their strength coursed through her veins, and their whispers carved her resolve into stone. What had begun as a night of terror was transforming into a night of awakening. And though she did not yet know how, deep in her bones she felt the promise of justice stirring. The moon had lit her path, the spirits had given her their voices, and together, they would guide her all the way back to the village that thought her gone forever. At first, her steps were hesitant, her body frail from hunger, her heart still carrying the sting of betrayal. But with every breath she drew under the silver glow of the moon, she felt the weight of despair shifting into something else, something harder, stronger, and unshakable. The whispers of the spirits still lingered in her ears, echoing like a rhythm that refused to fade. They were not only voices of comfort, they were voices of expectation. They had chosen her, and their sorrow, their pain, and their unfinished cries for justice were now stitched into her being. She could no longer think of herself as merely a girl abandoned to die in the wilderness. She was something more, someone carrying the fire of the past, someone meant to return. Her eyes, once clouded with tears, now reflected the moonlight like mirrors. She lifted her face to the night sky, the pale sphere above her shining brighter than she had ever seen. It was as if the moon itself leaned closer to her, offering its quiet power, wrapping her in a cloak of radiance. The beams that fell across the forest path seemed to bend just for her, guiding her feet to steady ground, warding off the darker corners where predators might wait. Each glimmer of silver light filled her with courage, as though the moon had made her its child, and no darkness could consume her again. Around her, the forest no longer felt like an enemy. The twisted trees, their bark scarred by time, stood like guardians. The rustling of leaves became applause for her courage. The cries of distant animals seemed to fade when she passed, as though the wild itself recognized her as something untouchable, chosen. Even the wind carried her forward, brushing against her skin like unseen hands pushing her along her path. Everything that had terrified her hours ago now seemed to bow in silent reverence. The wilderness had not been meant to end her, it had been meant to forge her. The girl's thoughts turned back to the faces of those who had betrayed her. She saw again the flickering torches, the harsh whispers, the hands that had pushed her away into the shadows of midnight. The memory did not weaken her, it sharpened her resolve. If they thought their cruelty would break her, they were wrong. If they believed their betrayal would erase her, they had misunderstood the very forces of the world they claimed to fear. She now carried with her the whispers of the dead, the power of the moon, and the embrace of the earth itself. She would not return as the same girl they abandoned. She would return as a storm they could not stop. Her pace quickened as her strength grew, her bare feet hardly feeling the stones and roots that once cut into her skin. It was as though her body, fragile and exhausted, was being renewed by every breath of night air. Hunger gnawed at her belly, yet it no longer mattered. Her fire came not from food but from within, from the mystical strength pouring into her veins. The spirit's whispers wove into her heartbeat, steady and fierce, each thud of her chest echoing with a promise. You will return. You will not bow. You will rise. As she walked, she felt a strange warmth coil inside her, as though an ember had been planted in her heart. At first it was small, a flicker that barely glowed. But with every thought of the cruelty she endured, and with every vision of the justice yet to come, the ember grew hotter, brighter, until she could almost imagine her veins glowing faintly beneath her skin. Her resolve was no longer only a thought, it was becoming a force, a fire that would not be extinguished. The moon above seemed to respond. Clouds tried to pass across its face, but they melted away, leaving the silver sphere unobstructed, blazing in the midnight sky. Its beams struck her shoulders, her hair, her face, crowning her in pale light. It was no longer simply a companion, it was a guide, a witness, a silent promise that she was not walking alone. Wherever she went, it would follow, and wherever it shone, her path would remain clear. She began to whisper softly, words of gratitude not just to the spirits but to the moon itself. I see you. I feel you. Walk with me until the end. And the light, unwavering, seemed to answer. The forest, too, pressed its loyalty upon her. She noticed how roots no longer snagged her feet but seemed to shift away just as she stepped. She noticed how the night's cold, once biting and merciless, now brushed her skin like a cooling balm, energizing instead of draining her. Even the owls and night creatures seemed to watch her not with predatory hunger but with silent acknowledgement, as though they recognized her as one of their own. Nature itself had embraced her, making her its daughter, its chosen spirit of retribution. The girl's resolve hardened with every moment. She thought of her return, of stepping back into the village where they had left her for dead. She pictured their faces, the shock, the disbelief, the fear. She did not imagine begging for their acceptance or pleading for her life. Those days were gone. Instead, she imagined standing tall, carrying with her the whispers of the forsaken, the strength of the wilderness and the light of the moon. They had abandoned her body, but they had awakened her spirit, and that mistake would cost them more than they could ever have foreseen. By the time dawn's first faint glow touched the horizon, she was no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. Her heart no longer carried only grief, it carried fire. Her mind no longer questioned whether she could survive, it asked only when she would return. And her spirit no longer felt alone, it was vast, filled with countless voices, bound to the eternal light of the moon that had guided her through the darkest hours. The girl who had once been fragile, innocent and discarded was gone. In her place walked someone unbreakable, someone chosen, someone who carried the weight of both life and death in her steps. And though her path was still long, and though her vengeance was still waiting, she now walked with a certainty carved in stone. She would return to confront those who abandoned her, and the same moon that lit her way now would shine upon their graves. The night was still when she finally reached the edge of the wilderness. The forest that had once seemed like a cage of shadows now parted before her, as though the branches themselves bent to let her pass. Her bare feet left no trace on the earth, though the ground was damp with night dew. Above, the moon poured its light down like a crown upon her head, its silver glow sharpening the lines of her face, making her appear older, stronger, and touched by something not entirely human. She no longer looked like the helpless girl who had been dragged into the darkness at midnight. She looked like someone who had been remade by it. The village, lying quiet under the night sky, seemed smaller than she remembered. The huts were scattered like sleeping bodies, their fires reduced to dying embers. Dogs stirred uneasily, whining low in their throats, as if they sensed a presence beyond their comprehension. A sudden hush fell over the crickets, the frogs, even the wind that used to whistle through the thatched roofs. The silence deepened as she stepped forward, her figure bathed in moonlight, casting a glow that seemed to stretch longer than any human shadow. It was not long before the first villager noticed her. A man who had been returning from tending his goats stopped dead in his tracks, the bundle of firewood slipping from his arms. His eyes widened, his lips parted, but no sound came out. To him she did not look like the abandoned girl left to die. She looked like an apparition, a figure who had crossed the line between the living and the dead. He stumbled back, muttering prayers under his breath, convinced that the night had spat her out with a curse clinging to her. The whispers spread like wildfire. She has returned. It cannot be her. The spirits have brought her back. Doors cracked open and faces peeked out, pale with fear. Children clung to their mothers, asking in trembling voices why the girl who had been cast away was now walking among them, calm and untouched. The elders, who had whispered the cruel orders that led to her abandonment, felt their throats tighten. Their bodies, old and bent, shivered as if a cold wind had sliced through the air, though the night was warm. As she walked into the center of the village, subtle signs followed her. A clay pot cracked on its own though no one touched it. A flame that had been nearly extinguished suddenly flared up, sending sparks spiraling into the air. A goat broke free of its tether and knelt in the dust before her, as though in submission. These were not grand miracles, but small, undeniable disturbances that made the villagers tremble all the more. Her eyes swept over them, steady and unreadable. She did not speak. She did not accuse. Her silence was heavier than words, pressing down on them until their own guilt began to rise like bile in their throats. Mothers remembered how they had stayed silent when she was led away. Fathers recalled how they had looked away, pretending not to see. The very children who had once mocked her now hid behind their parents, unwilling to meet her gaze. Some dropped to their knees, whispering apologies they dared not say aloud. Others fled into their huts, covering their ears, as though the weight of her presence was too much to bear. Yet no matter where they went, they could not escape the sight of her standing there, draped in moonlight, a living reminder of their betrayal. Still she did not speak. The moon above glowed brighter, almost unnaturally so, casting shadows across the ground that twisted and writhed like restless spirits. The villagers began to murmur that she was not walking alone, that something unseen walked with her, step for step, silent but watching. The whispers of spirits from the wilderness clung to her like a veil, and though no one else could see them, everyone felt their presence. By the time the night grew deeper, the village had changed. Its people no longer looked at her as a girl they once envied or feared. They looked at her as an omen. Her return was no simple survival. It was a reckoning, guided by forces that even the boldest among them dared not challenge. And so she stood there in silence, the abandoned girl who was no longer abandoned, the outcast who now carried the weight of the moon on her shoulders. The villagers waited for her to speak, to condemn, to forgive, but she gave them nothing. Only the glow of her otherworldly presence, and the knowledge that their world would never again be free from the shadow of what they had done. The moon rode high above the village like a silent witness, its silver light spilling over every hut and path. She stood at the center, her gaze sweeping over the faces that dared to look at her. Many hid in shadows, trembling, but she could feel the weight of guilt that clung to certain hearts. The whispers of the spirits, soft and insistent, circled around her ears, guiding her eyes to those who had led her into the wilderness. One by one, their names were spoken in the silence, not aloud, but in the cold echo that only she and the moon seemed to hear. The first was the woman who had pressed her hand hardest against the girl's back on the night of betrayal. Now she cowered near her doorway, clutching a child to her chest, but the child screamed and pulled away as though sensing a darkness in her touch. The girl stepped forward, the earth shifting beneath her feet. Roots curled from the ground like fingers, wrapping themselves around the woman's ankles, dragging her into the dirt until she was bound and helpless. Her cries rose sharp into the night, but no one dared intervene. The villagers watched, frozen, as the roots tightened, their bark cutting into flesh until she was silenced, her body held firm against the earth as though swallowed by the very ground she had condemned another to. Next was a man with eyes that once gleamed with greed. He had whispered lies, saying the girl was cursed, stirring the others into fear so they would turn against her. Now he tried to flee, pushing through the crowd, but the air itself seemed to thicken around him. His steps slowed, his chest heaved, and his hands clawed desperately at nothing. The girl's eyes followed him, unblinking, and with every glance the moonlight wrapped tighter around his body, binding him in a pale glow. He collapsed to the ground, gasping, his veins burning with a cold fire that made him scream for forgiveness. But the light showed no mercy, it burned away the strength in his limbs, leaving him writhing and broken before the gathering eyes. The elders were next. They had not dirted their own hands, but their silence had been the cruelest blade. They had stood in the shadows, nodding, giving their approval as she was cast out. Now as she turned toward them, the air grew colder, carrying the whispers of the spirits louder, sharper, like the hiss of snakes. The elders trembled, clutching their staffs, but the staffs splintered in their hands, cracking under an unseen force. Their shadows lengthened unnaturally, rising against the huts, twisting into shapes that seemed to mock them. The villagers gasped as the shadows wrapped around the elders' necks, pulling them down to their knees. Their mouths opened to cry out, but the only sound that came forth was the whisper of the wilderness itself, condemning them in voices not their own. She moved slowly, steadily, never rushing, never faltering. Each step was deliberate, each act of vengeance carried out with the calm certainty of justice. She did not shout or rage, her silence was heavier than thunder, her eyes colder than the night air. The villagers could not look away. They were forced to watch as those guilty of betrayal were marked, punished, or broken by forces they could not understand. Some saw the moon's light as her weapon. Others swore the earth, the air, and the shadows themselves answered her command. Whatever the truth, none doubted that she was no longer merely a girl. By the time her path was complete, the guilty lay scattered, bound, broken, or silenced, each punished in a way that reflected their cruelty. The innocent stood trembling, tears streaking their faces, unable to comprehend how she had endured what they had condemned her to. The village was no longer the same. It was not only the guilty who felt the weight of her presence. Even those untouched by her wrath now feared the judgment that might come should they ever stray into betrayal. At last she stood at the center of it all once more. Her breath was steady, her hands unstained, yet everyone knew the night had bent itself around her will. She did not need to speak. Her silence was the voice of the moon, the whisper of spirits, the unbreakable truth that no sin remains buried forever. The village had always been a place of noise, voices clashing in markets, gossip circling like restless birds, the crackle of fires and the laughter of children. But after that night, silence pressed down on every hut and every path like an unseen weight. People moved slower, spoke softer, and glanced nervously at the moon each time it rose above the horizon. Fear had settled into their bones, replacing the arrogance and cruelty that once guided their choices. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispering warnings in their ears that no one had dared speak before. Never mock, never betray, never raise a hand against the innocent, lest the same fate befall them. Fathers who once barked orders now carried shame in their eyes, remembering how easily they had followed the whispers of envy, superstition, and fear. Even the children, too young to understand the depth of betrayal, could feel the tension. They no longer played freely after dusk. They no longer teased or mocked the strange or the gentle-hearted. The shadow of the girl's presence, even if she was gone, hovered over them like a second sky. At night the whispers grew stronger. Not real voices, perhaps, but the weight of guilt and memory echoing in the villagers' minds. They dreamed of the girl's eyes, cold and calm, watching from the edges of moonlight. Some woke gasping, certain they had felt her gaze inside their huts, certain that ash or shadow had brushed across their throats. Doors were bolted, fires burned later than ever before, but no wall or flame could erase the sense that judgment lingered just beyond sight. The elders, once so proud and commanding, had been broken. Those who survived their punishment walked bent and silent, no longer seeking to guide or dominate. Their words, once heavy with authority, were now little more than mutters of regret. The younger villagers looked at them with unease, as though the weight of their silence was contagious. No one asked their advice anymore, no one trusted their leadership. Their downfall had become a warning etched into every conversation. Arrogance can summon storms, and silence can be a blade sharper than any spear. Some tried to explain away what had happened. They said it was the madness of the night, the tricks of the moon, the chaos of superstition. They convinced themselves the girl was gone, swallowed by the spirits she had awakened. But deep down none truly believed it. The fear was not only of her return but of the truth her story had carved into their hearts, that cruelty has a price, and the innocent are not without protectors. The marketplace, once filled with gossip and laughter, became a place of hushed tones and sidelong glances. No one dared speak the girl's name aloud, yet everyone carried her memory like a burden they could not set down. Offerings began to appear at the edge of the forest, bowls of grain, fruits, carved figures of wood or stone. They were not left for the spirits alone, but for her, the girl who had walked into darkness and returned cloaked in the power of moonlight. The villagers no longer thought of her as one of their own, but as something greater, something to fear, something to honor. Children grew up hearing the tale retold in whispers, of a girl abandoned, of the moon that guided her, of the vengeance that reshaped their lives. Mothers told it as a warning, fathers as a confession, elders as a bitter truth. And though the details shifted with each retelling, the fear remained constant, passed from one generation to the next. Humility took root where pride had once grown. Kindness was offered more freely, suspicion less readily. Strangers were treated with caution but not with cruelty. Whenever jealousy sparked in a villager's heart, they thought of the girl, of the ash and shadows that had answered her pain, and the envy withered before it could bear fruit. The story of her suffering became the village's unseen law, a reminder carved not on stone or wood but on the very souls of those who survived. And so the village endured, changed forever, not by decree, not by war, but by fear, regret, and the memory of an innocent girl who had once walked among them, only to rise above them in the hour of betrayal. The villagers never forgot. They dared not. The moon's glow each night was enough to remind them.